Hi class, welcome to the second part of the introductory unit on the Incas. This is an overall look at the origin legends and some of the rulers. It is not intended to have a great amount of detail, but give you an overall look at the empire from chronologically speaking and from end to end. So away we go. In your reading, you'll notice that we have a variety of sources for this material in addition to archaeology. The written sources are written by Spanish and Indian writers. Both groups of writers, ethnically, did write after the conquest. We do not have pre-conquest writings by the Inca folk. And interestingly, depending on the propaganda reasons for writing or what their overall approach was to European culture or Indian culture, we find in both Spanish and Indian writers that some groups elevated, spoke positively of the Inca Empire, while others sought to discredit it as being uncivilized. Again, in both Spanish and Indian writers, you would find this. Now, today's historian can collect these dozens and even hundreds of versions of the Inca past, and with a critical eye to what they're saying, using a variety of criterion, which makes some more believable than others, you can blend them to a basic chronology up to 1532, and that is when the empire fell in Cajamarca, when the emperor Atahualpa was captured, ransomed, and then murdered. By the way, he has Huascar, who's in his control, also murdered before he dies. So the two rival emperors are gone in 1532. Now, writing, as I mentioned, had not developed in the pre-conquest world like the Mexica had gotten close to. Of course, they had the hieroglyphics, so it is writing and not textual writing. Now back to the Incas, they had not developed this. Their communication was either oral, so they had a variety of runners that would run like the Pony Express. They had a certain route they would run and then pass on the message orally, and these runners are called chasqui, and then the message itself could quickly go from one end of the empire to the other if needed. Now, in a non-oral way, quipus, these knotted cords that you can see here, was another way in which the empire communicated with each other. Modern anthropologists and archaeologists have not yet broke the code on what these quipus sought, what meaning they sought to share with others. So we've gotten, I think, some. I'm going to pull back a bit. We're getting close, but I don't, so far, don't believe we have broken the quipu code. So in this slide, we see at the top an example of one of the dozens to hundreds of histories of the Incas written in the 1500s. This is by Pedro Cieza de Leon, a Spanish who was pro-Inca. He thought the Inca past was valuable and godly and noble. And so you'll find him as a fairly balanced and even pro-Indian Spanish writer. So he wrote that, as you can see, in 1553. And down below you can see an example of a quipu in a museum. So with these sources, there are two main origin stories that emerge. There are some others, but there are two main ones. One of these Pacarinas is that the Cusco ethnic group came from Pacaritambo in Lake Titicaca. You can see a picture of this lake here on the left above. And in this origin story, what we find is that an overall almost genderless creator called Viracocha, he created a number of pairs of men and women who were brother-sisters who emerged from caves, and among this group are Manco Capac and Mama Occhio. A little bit on Mama Occhio's name. Mama means in Quechuan, it means mother or lady. That's a combined meaning, if you will. And Okyo means pure. And Manco Capac and Mama Okyo led the migrations to Cusco, and there Manco Capac turned into a waka, which would be like a sacred item, almost like a relic. We'll go more into that as we move forward through the Inca material. Leaving the kingship to his son, all the males who had traveled with him, according to his origin story, had died, and so Manco Capac and all of his sisters is where, in fact, all Cusco people gain their lineage. The other origin story was that Manco Capac and Mama Okyo, so same two people, they were created by Inti, the sun god. Inti, by the way, would be a sun god who would be paired with Moon, the moon god, which is Okyo as well. We'll get into that later. Okay, so in this version, they came from actually not Lake Titicaca, from a different region, and they came to Cusco, and the story follows in a similar way. So the book goes into a little bit of how we can know, from a historical point of view, what happened. And the basic answer for this class is that whether you look at the scholars on the pages 62 and 63 about whether there's truth in there, if it's some historical truth that got changed, or if they're complete stories, but they, although they're mythical, they give us some knowledge, so on and so forth. Are they true or not? Well, not the way we would want, a witness to be in a court telling the story about what happened on a certain day. They're not as reliable in a factual way, but they do give us the general gist of what was going on, of the movement of peoples. And interestingly, these two different stories follow two main groups of people who became part of Cusco, and they each have their own version of the story. So what you see is what the versions share is in fact more likely to be true. We call this being independently or multiply attested. That's the criterion of multiple attestation. So anyway, a little bit historically true, yes, no. For this class, we don't have to worry about it, but we do know that generally the migration occurred. Looking at archaeology to combine with the stories, what we tend to see is that Cusco as a region did have people prior to 1100 CE. They are not a strong empire at this time, but are coexisting with many groups of people in the Andean region. And in the previous section, we learned about the Tiwanaku and Wari empires, and Cusco would have been part of those empires. They would have been subdued by them. But between 1100, as those empires wane, and 1438, when Cusco's Inca Empire really gets going, what we find is that we see evidence of growth. Slow growth, but steady growth during those 300 years. It's after 1438 that the Inca Empire, kind of as we know it or we study it, really gets going and develops more in a more pronounced manner. So very quickly, in just a number of years, what we find is that the Inca Empire quickly creates itself. It conquers ayllus over thousands of miles and fairly well absorbs them into a larger empire. We'll go, of course, into that in more detail. So, like the Mexica introduction, what's one element we should take away from this, especially from a Native American studies point of view, is that the concept of a Native American way needs to include this group, who by 1532, like the Mexica, are urban Native Americans. They live in stone buildings. They live in large, complex social units that can run into the thousands and tens of thousands of people. They have emperors and princes and princesses and male priests and female priestesses and large, complex religions and all the rest that we're going to go into in this unit. So it should remind us that if we're looking at a pre-European contact Native American way, of course we think that there are many. That's probably not new to a lot of college age students today. But even when we think of large, diverse Native American populations, sometimes we forget about the millions, of course, in central Mexico and the millions in the Andes that definitely outnumber the North American Indians, even if you count them all up north of Mexico up to the North Pole. So it doesn't mean they're more important because there are more of them. It just means we need to broaden our lens and understanding. If we go post-European conquest in a course that doesn't exist yet, it'd be really fun to compare and contrast the colonial experience of, a dozen different Native American tribes from different regions and see if what was similar and what was not similar about a central Mexican colonial experience with, let's say, that of the Powhatans in the Chesapeake Bay or the Iroquois in upstate New York, so on and so forth. So keep your eyes peeled for that one. That's something we're going to talk about doing. So, basic conclusions. Incas were the last, at least if you count the Spanish conquest as some sort of end, in a long line of civilizations, and they had built upon thousands of years of experience and learning, and that geographically, due to their placement between the two previous empires, and because of some certain migrations of the two main groups that formed Cusco, Cusco really began to flourish after the 1100s, and it borrowed upon what was already there and began to improve it. This, of course, is not a photograph from the 1100s, but from the modern day up near Sacsayhuaman, which we're going to look at. But this is the valley of Cusco today, and this is where the Inca Empire really got going. Interestingly, if you haven't thought about it, why is Cusco so small and Mexico City so large? Is that the Spanish system, colonial system, decided not to build their capital city in that small valley in Cusco, but instead chose a coastal city. But Mexico City, of course, the center of the Spanish Empire and colony, was built right there on top of the Aztec group. So, all right, so here again, a reminder of how large that Cusco area will grow, and all the way up into Ecuador and Quito, and down into the areas we now call Chile, right? So there is a table which gives you the name of the emperors. We're not going to have you memorize the names of the emperors, but some are going to be fairly important, and we're going to make slides for them. Again, 1438 being the important turning point that you'll want to know about. Up here we can see the Inca and the Coya, the male and female paired rulers of the Inca Empire being carried around. So around 1438, we have our moment with the last of the first group, 1 through 8 emperors, Viracocha, with or without legitimacy. He began to rule. He turns the dynasty towards his family. It's very possible that he rewrote the history to make his rise to power more legitimate. What we do begin to see, interestingly, is that the Inti religious followers began to lose out to the Viracocha religious followers. So, anyway, in 1438, the Chancas group attacked Cusco, and Viracocha and his legitimate son withdrew, leaving Inca Yupanqui, which we're going to call Pachacuti as well, earthquake or earthshaker. He defended Cusco successfully, and then his generals elevated him, Inca Yupanqui or Pachacuti, to Inca and then killed the previous Inca and the children and the like. Did this happen? It's possible that both Viracocha and Inca Kusiyupanqui or Pachacuti's versions of these stories are twisted a bit to make their seizure of power more legitimate. So, did it happen? It's possible. Did it not happen? Maybe not. We don't have a clear view, but these are the stories being circulated by 1532. Interestingly, if no one believed this story that had been repeated for 100 years and it was just a complete crock of BS, perhaps more Native Americans would have told the Spanish this in the 1530s. But instead, uh, that's not quite what we see. On the right, here we have a much, much later drawing. So this is not an accurate drawing. This is done over 100 years after the conquest by a Native American writer named Felipe Huaman Poma de Ayala. So if you do look at Viracocha, we see an important design element we're going to get back to in his tunic. That is a very Andean look he has going on there. And on the right, Guaman Poma de Ayala has drawn his version of Pachacuti. For the next few decades, when Pachacuti ruled and began to expand much, much further than Viracocha and all the 8 emperors before him, what we tend to see is that he first consolidated internal power. He began to purge opponents, force them to join him, or to eliminate them through murder or exile and their families. And so internally, he began to kind of clean house. Second, he began to lead military campaigns against nearby Ayus and towards the area of Lake Titicaca, about 30 or more kilometers away. And then, after the surrounding areas were fairly subdued, he turned his attention to rebuild Cusco as an imperial center, as a new organized imperial center. He most likely burned many areas to the ground to rebuild the imperial city in a way that would be recognize its importance and its centralness to how the Cusco folks were building their universe. There are 2 open plazas that he had created, and they represented the ceremonial center of the empire where the 4 Suyus that we already learned about kind of converged. The dot on this map shows you where that is and how the areas around it, especially on the upper side, the northern side, is where the Cusco imperial buildings were kind of all built. And further up north, you can see Sacsayhuaman, and that is an important fort that was built to defend against certain groups. It's not. It's a very small area. It's not going to defend the whole city, as you can see, but it did play a role. So when you go to Cusco one day and you stand in that plaza, you'll know that, like the photograph at the north at the top, you are at the center of the Inca universe where the 4 Suyus decided to converge. Below, you can see Sacsayhuaman, which are the largest stone structures. Now, they're not the largest structures, but they're the structures made of the largest stones in the Americas. So up to hundreds of tons each. Again, like the Aztec area, this is done without the technological innovation of the wheel and without having metal goods or large beasts of burden, but of course they have alpaca and llama and lots of people. So it gives you kind of a visual what's going on. Having troubles here with the button, so hold on. Here, we're going to try again, see how it does. There we go. So the book goes through quite a few of these rulers after and before Pachacuti. Here are the ones after. We see that in 1471 to 1493, Tupac Inca Yupanqui is able to continue the conquering that has already begun really spreads it out in terms of square miles more than anyone before him, from Bolivia all the way up to Quito. And Huayna Capac uh, has been conquering with Tupac Inca Yupanqui uh, and continues to push, but he is met with more resistance. Ironically, this is due to the populations he's now starting to bump against not being as advanced or civilized in terms of sedentary ways. They are more nomadic, and he has a problem with that. One problem for him is that he remained mostly in Quito, making it a second capital. He had a number of wives and children there he was really growing fond of. And this meant that back in Cusco, where Cusco folks said was the real capital, many of his rivals had begun to stand in for him in the ceremonial manner, but also making decisions. While he was way up in Quito, he couldn't make every decisions, and so there are many making decisions in ways he wouldn't like or didn't like out of Cusco. And this shows us that the empire had grown very unwieldy and it was very large. In 1525, Huayna Capac died, most likely of a European disease, and this launched the Quito faction against the Cusco faction. Huascar was his legitimate son in Cusco, and Atahualpa was his legitimate son up in Quito. And so both these regions fought each other to obtain or keep the Inca Empire in their control. And interestingly, as the Pizarro expedition, which has been traveling, by the way, for over 10 years so far, as it finally approaches the Inca Empire in 1532, there is a major civil war going on after the death of Huayna Capac. So 1532 is the key year where the Spanish expedition makes great inroads. Now, after 1532, post-Spanish conquest emperors, again from a Native American studies approach, of course these are continuations of the Inca world. However, structurally they are less powerful than the group prior to 1532 because the Spanish armies are present and allying with some, fighting others. There's a very complicated mix of people now, and the Inca emperors are living in a different world. Now, eventually, the Inca emperors reject the colonial agreement of Huascar and Atahualpa and Topawalpa, which had all, in some measure, tried to work with the Spanish to maintain their own Inca domination. And Manco Inca is the individual who, in 1535 and 1536, rebelled against Cusco occupation. And he almost succeeded. He was troubling to the Spanish occupation, there's a illustration of this by Felipe Huaman Poma de Ayala again on the right. But he wasn't able to succeed in both times. And so he fled into the Montaña area to Vilcabamba and began to rule as Inca in exile. There was a number of Incas who ruled from exile. The final one was Tupac Amaru, who was captured and killed in 1575. And for those who want a little PS on this, his name Tupac might sound familiar. And I'm sorry, 1572 when Tupac Amaru was captured and killed. The West Coast rapper Tupac Shakur was born in prison, and his mother named him Tupac Amaru Shakur. Here's an illustration of Manco Inca setting fire to Cusco during his siege of 1536. Of course, it is not a historically accurate drawing. It is one made, again, about 100 years after the conquest. And in 1572, here is Tupac Amaru I, because there will be another person hundreds of years later who takes on Tupac Amaru's name. So we call this guy the first. Here he is being executed by the Spanish officials. They are hoping to end the Inca position as a rallying point for anti-colonial action.